Hello everyone, welcome back. Now we're going to talk about forward contracts, future contracts, which are pretty similar with slight differences. And are the first derivatives we want to talk about because they are the oldest derivative. And they were originally there from our agricultural markets because from time to time farmers they would want to lock in certain prices. So suppose you're a farmer, you want to grow some wheat, and then you want to lock in certain wheat price somewhere in the future, then you can enter into a forward contract because that is what a forward contract is. A forward contract is a way to sell at certain price in the future. So you can take either a long position or a short position. Long position, you want to buy something at a pre-specified price, and short position, you want to sell something at this pre-specified price. Typically forward contracts trade over the counter. So it's just two parties getting together, calling each other up, trying to set a contract, which is typically not too liquid. So for example, what you could think of is suppose you have this certain company that needs to pay its supplier, for instance, and in 6 months it needs to pay £1 million, 1 million British pounds. Well, what it can do is simply wait 6 months and then pay the price in terms of pounds, but it can also try to already lock in a certain exchange rate so that it knows exactly how many US dollars it needs to pay in 6 months. So in this case, the risk of currency fluctuations is hedged by this investor or this corporation. Now let's look. So what can they do? Well, they can go long on a forward contract on British pounds at a forward rate of 2.05. So in 6 months, it will buy £1 million with a forward contract rate of $2.05 per pound. So my question then to you is, if the forward rate is 2.05 per pound and the spot rate in 6 months is going to be $2.1 $2.1 per pound, how much will the company need to pay in 6 months if it enters into this forward contract? I'll give you a moment to pause me. And it's going to be 205 million, right? So it locks in this forward price of 2.05. So that means that in 6 months it's going to pay 1 million times 2.05. So 2.05 million. This also means that, hey, if it locks in this 2.05, then it made a little profit, right? Because if the spot rate is 210 and the forward rate was 205, then rather than paying 2.1 million, it only needed to pay 2.05 million. So my question to you is, hey, what is this forward contract worth in 6 months if the spot rate is 2.1? And what if the spot rate is 1.9? Give you a moment to pause me. And then, well, if the spot rate is 210, then of course they made a little profit. They're paying less than they would have if they would have waited and bought the pounds in the spot market. If the spot rate goes to 1.9, they're paying more in the forward contract than they would have paid in the market, so they're making a loss. All right. So in general, the payoff from a long position in a forward contract is the spot price minus the forward price, so times, of course, the size of the position. Then we also have futures. So futures highly similar to forwards, but they are very standardized. And why are they standardized? Well, or what is the use of them being standardized? Well, besides being more transparent, futures contracts also have a way in which they can eliminate credit risk. So the big problem with forward contracts, of course, you enter it with one other party, then suppose that other party defaults, so goes bankrupt, then you're left with nothing because, well, who's going to pay who's going to honor your forward contract by then? In order to prevent this credit risk, you could enter into a future. So what is a future? Future is a highly standardized forward contract which has all these specifications that are right there in the contract. So it specifies what is the underlying asset, what's the contract size, delivery location, delivery time, price limits, position limits. And one important difference between forward contracts and future contracts is with future contracts you typically have to put up a margin account. So what is a margin account? that is an amount of cash or marketable securities that you deposit somewhere in order to act as collateral. So even if you default, that means that your counterparty can still access that money as their collateral. So this at least tries to minimize the possibility of a loss through a default on either party. So as an example, so suppose you have an investor that wants to take a long position in 2 gold futures, and those gold futures have a certain contract size of 100 ounces and a future price of 600. Then on June the 5th, what they would need to pay is 100 times 600, so 60,000 per contract. And then it turns out that the margin requirements for this contract are 2,000 per contract. So you do not need to put the entire amount up as a margin account, but just some amount as margin account. So in this case, 2,000 for a $60,000 contract. And then there's the so-called maintenance margin, which is in this case 1.5 thousand per contract. So how does this maintenance margin work? Well, whenever your margin account goes below this maintenance margin, you're given a so-called margin call. So someone calls you up, says, hey, you need to fill up your margin back up to this original margin requirement. So what would that look like? So for instance, here, if we have this futures price of 600, then as the price declines, well, we're losing money, right? Because now we're paying more for our future contract than we would in the spot market. But so far we're only making, well, $600 loss. And on our total margin account, that means that, well, we're still in the clear here because it's still above this critical value of 3,000. So what if the price declines even further? Well, at a certain point, we have losses that are so big that we have a margin account balance of less than 3,000. Then our broker calls us up, says, hey, you need to refill your margin account, so fill it up to the original 4,000, and then we can continue. And then at a certain point, if hey, the losses are such that the margin account is once again below 3,000, then we once again get a margin call, hey, fill it back up, and then that should, in that way, kind of cover the losses that you make over time and hopefully eliminate some of the credit risk that you would otherwise bear. So what's the nice thing about futures is that because they are so traded, they are so standardized, you can also settle them daily. So you can have a daily settlement price. So what is the price on this thing? And what is also, well, is different between forwards and futures is that most forwards are just contracts like, hey, deliver me something somewhere in the future, and then the product actually gets delivered. For these future positions, a lot of the time between the final delivery date and the start of the contract, they are closed out with a countervailing contract. So try to simply get the value from the price change in the contract in the future without actually having to deliver anything. So most of these future contracts, they are closed out before delivery date. So that is a big difference here. So here's just this list of these two things. So forwards, private contract between two parties, whereas futures are exchange traded. Forwards, there's no standard contract. Futures, there is. Usually forwards have one specified delivery date. Futures can have a whole range because, well, there's all these different contracts. Futures are settled daily, so you get daily updates on the prices. Forwards don't get settled until the end of the contract. And forwards are typically delivered, but futures are typically closed out for maturity, so risk hedged in another way. And forwards, there's some credit risk. Futures, there's no credit risk because of the margin account. All right, then of course you want to know how to price these things, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next part of this lecture.